living room and around the world. And now, your feature presentation.
What if there was a way, without being an athlete, to feel what athletes feel? To play all the time, instead of working. Or else to enjoy work so much that it becomes essentially the same thing. It's 1962 in Portland, Oregon, and Phil Knight is at a crossroads in life. He's just graduated from college and now has an impossible choice to make. Does he follow the standard route expected of him, of getting a stable yet ultimately unfulfilling career? Or does he take the path less traveled, into the unknown, to pursue a crazy business idea that he just can't stop thinking about? Success has always been traditionally defined as having a good job, getting married, starting a family, and the house with the white picket fence. But deep down, Phil knows he wants something different, something purposeful and creative and important. He wants to leave his mark on the world, which brings him back to that crazy business idea he had in college. Maybe, just maybe, it could actually work. He begins running harder and faster, like he's chasing something, until he catches his second wind. In his final year at college, Phil took a course on entrepreneurship, and the assignment was to come up with a business plan and present it to the class. Phil quickly spots a potential opportunity. It's the 60s, and Japanese manufacturers were making inroads into the camera market, long dominated by German companies. Japan's focus on efficiency and lower labor costs helped them undercut the industry leader. And Phil began theorizing that the same could also be true for running shoes, another product dominated by German companies that Japan was also challenging. And it was a product that Phil, as an avid runner, already had an intimate knowledge of. His mock business would import low-cost running shoes from Japan and sell them for high profits in America. His presentation was met with mostly blank stares from his classmates. The teacher was impressed and gave him an A. But now that school's out, Phil is not at all looking forward to the prospect of working a boring job for the rest of his life. And the class assignment is still on his mind. He's young and figures he may never get the chance to have a wild adventure like this later in life. So he decides to just go for it and fly to Japan to find a manufacturer and try to make his pretend business into a reality. But to do that, first he'll need his father's permission to go traveling abroad instead of finding a job. And more importantly, he'll need his money for the plane ticket, which wouldn't be easy. His father was a stern patriarch, a lawyer turned newspaper publisher who prided himself on maintaining a sterling reputation among the high society circles of Portland. He would surely reject such an outlandish request. His dad revealed to him that he had regretted not seeing the world more when he was his son's age. The trip is on. Phil packs a suit and catches a flight to the land of the rising sun during a time when 90% of Americans had never even traveled more than 100 miles from their homes, and he was headed to a country that not too long ago was at war with America, all to pursue a crazy idea. The way Phil saw it, history is just one long processional of crazy ideas. Phil arrives in Kobe and secures a meeting with Onitsuka, maker of the popular Tiger running shoe brand. The company is Japan's premier athletic shoe manufacturer, boasting 500 shops across the island nation, with a growing reputation among international runners, while still relatively unknown in America. This is it. He gives himself a quick pep talk. You are capable. You are confident. You can do this. You can do this. He's brought into a stuffy boardroom occupied by a clan of stone-faced executives. He had rehearsed this meeting countless times in his head, but now face to face with these titans of industry, his mind draws a blank. All eyes are on him now. It's the moment of truth, his one and only shot at making a first impression. And he's stuck. Struggling to remember anything, he begins repeating the same presentation he made in his business class, word for word, emphasizing the very lucrative US market for running shoes. An executive asks, "How big of a market is it?" But Phil didn't know. Horrified, he realized he hadn't done enough homework. On the spot, he comes up with the biggest number he can think of. It's $1 billion market. It was a total bluff, an utter shot in the dark. The executives begin excitedly chatting amongst themselves, and then one asks a follow-up question. "What is the name of your company?" But Phil hadn't thought about that either. His mind begins to race again. His eyes are on the executive, but he starts looking through him as memories of his childhood bedroom begin flooding to the surface. He now only sees the running trophies and blue ribbons on his wall and blurts out, "Blue Ribbon Sports of Portland, Oregon." They only have one more question for Phil. Would Blue Ribbon Sports be interested in representing Onitsuka in America? Why, yes. Yes, it would. He's made it all the way to Japan with nothing but a dream and has talked his way into a deal to sell tigers in America. He's presented the paperwork to formalize what he hopes to be the beginning of a beautiful friendship. Phil places a sample order with Onitsuka and works as an accountant while waiting a full year for the shipment to arrive. And when it finally does, he knows exactly who he wants to send a pair to first. His old college track coach, Bill Bowerman. He was a man of Oregon, whose reputation was world-renowned, having led athletes in the NCAA as well as the Olympics, and 16 of his runners would break the 4-minute mile. But Bowerman was much more than a coach. He was a mad scientist, constantly in his garage, modifying his runner shoes to improve their performance. Bowerman likes the Tigers so much, he wants to be Phil's business partner, offering money for inventory and suggesting Phil keep 51% equity to retain control. But even with Bowerman's chip-in, Phil still doesn't have enough to place an official order, once again forcing him to turn to the bank of Dad. But for him, the mood had already changed. He didn't put his son through college just for him to become a damn door-to-door shoe salesman. But overhearing them from the kitchen, Phil's mom takes cash out of her purse and says in a tone loud enough for her husband to hear, "I'd like to purchase 1 pair of limber-ups, please." It's 1964 and Blue Ribbon Sports is officially open for business. Phil loads his car with tigers and heads downtown to try and get them into local sporting goods stores. But all the shop owners tell him the same thing. Not interested. According to them, the world doesn't need another running shoe. Phil was facing resistance right out of the gate, but he didn't come this far to let rejection stop him now. He hits the road and starts selling tigers out of the trunk of his car. He would roll up to track meets all along the Pacific Northwest, showing off his merchandise and getting an enthusiastic response everywhere he went. The nifty new shoes from Japan were practically selling themselves. He also prints out flyers and posts them all over town with his number and address included. Soon, not only was the phone ringing off the hook, but twitchy runners began showing up at his father's doorstep like dope fiends looking to score. There in his living room, Phil's dad would watch his son conduct business in utter disbelief, while his mom was in the kitchen, either cooking or doing dishes, but always while wearing a pair of size 6 Tiger running shoes. Life couldn't be going any better. Phil was happier than he'd ever been, selling footwear to help his fellow runners. He was living the dream, making money doing what he loved. But then, the other shoe dropped. One day out of the blue, Phil gets a letter from a wrestling coach in New York who used to be a print model as the Marlboro Man. Phil opens the envelope and is met with a deadly surprise. The Marlboro Man claimed that he had just secured national distribution rights from Onitsuka and was now demanding that Phil cease and desist. His fairy tale world is shattered. This can't be happening. He'd only started his business 2 months ago and is already grappling with a menacing rival attempting to bully him into submission by threatening Blue Ribbon Sports with swift legal action. Phil fires off a frantic letter to Onitsuka seeking reassurance of his deal with them. And then he waits. And he waits. But he gets no response. This was a nightmare. His dream was being stripped away from him and he couldn't do anything about it. Over the entire summer, Phil moped around the house, utterly inconsolable over the sudden demise of his shoe company. It was all over before it had even started. By summer's end, with still no word back from Japan, Phil was beginning to accept the harsh reality that he would have to give up and get a real job. But on Labor Day, he changed his mind. He can't let it end like this, even if it means flying back to Japan to meet with Onitsuka. His dad still didn't like him selling shoes, but he also didn't like anybody messing with his son either. His parents both agree that he should go back and fight for his business. His mom offers to drive him to the airport. Phil is too tense to speak during the entire car ride. After arriving at the gate, his mom leaves him with the parting words, "Just be yourself." Phil's back in Japan, back at the Onitsuka office, and this time, he comes face to face with the owner and namesake of the company himself, Mr. Onitsuka. Phil had spent the entire flight preparing a professional presentation, but now, sitting across from him, he abandons his notes and instead launches into a heartfelt rant highlighting Blue Ribbon's strong sales and how much they were growing, but how stressing it was to have the Marlboro Man crossing their turf. Mr. Onitsuka gets out of his chair, walks over to the window, and begins gazing into downtown Kobe. He finally breaks the silence by speaking about a marvelous vision he has of the future. Everyone in the world wear athletic shoes all the time. I know this day come. He then lowers his gaze onto Phil and in a soft voice tells him, "You remind me of myself when I am young." Mr. Onitsuka decides to allow Blue Ribbon to keep selling tigers in the western states, and they would restrict the Marlboro Man's sales to the east. Blue Ribbon would live on. Phil is overjoyed. Suddenly, all of the majestic beauty of his surroundings comes fully into focus, and instead of flying right back home, he decides to spend some time exploring more of Japan. With his guidebook in hand, he catches a train. Next stop, Mount Fuji. They met in the clouds, at a resting station on the side of the snow-capped mountain. She was also an American tourist in her early 20s and came from a wealthy family in Maryland. Her father owned a candy bar company. She noticed he wasn't sweaty like the other climbers, which he attributed to his conditioning as a half-mile runner. She ends up visiting him in Portland, against her father's wishes, and charms the whole family at dinner. Then the star-crossed lovers share a magical week together playing house. Afterwards, they maintained a long-distance relationship. But eventually, the frequency of their communications started decreasing, until one day, the honeymoon ends. Over the phone, she tells him that she wants to break up. Phil is devastated. He wrote to her, pleading that she reconsider. And she wrote him back. The answer was still no. In his first year in business, Phil sold 1,300 pairs of Tiger running shoes, generating $8,000 in sales. One day, at a random track meet, he runs into an old college teammate, Jeff Johnson. He's a married social worker now with a baby on the way, and to make extra money, he's selling shoes on the side. For Adidas. Phil can't believe it. He offers Johnson $1.75 for each pair of Tigers he could sell instead. At the time, running for exercise wasn't even considered a thing. Joggers were seen as wackos and were often mocked and even harassed when spotted in public. Johnson, the social worker, now found his true calling serving the persecuted runners of the world. He would file away his customer details on index cards to keep in close contact with all of them. And he'd regularly send out tips and tricks and birthday and Christmas cards, as well as letters congratulating them on winning their races. Johnson's tireless efforts led to sales more than doubling. By year 3, Blue Ribbon was doing well enough to open a physical store down in Santa Monica, California, making money hand over fist. company was growing year over year. But according to the bank, that was a problem. They told him, growth off of your balance sheet is dangerous. But Phil was confused. How could a company grow too fast? He argued, life is growth. Business is growth. You grow or you die. However, the bank manager was indifferent. But the bank was the least of Phil's problems. His contract with Onitsuka was expiring when Johnson discovered an ad inside of a track and field magazine by somebody claiming to be the national supplier of Tiger running shoes. And it wasn't a stranger. The Marlboro Man was back, and deadlier than ever. If the ad was true, then Blue Ribbon's days were numbered. But Phil is back in Japan now to renew his contract, and Mr. Onitsuka does have a fondness for him, so maybe he will side with Phil over the Marlboro Man once and for all. Unfortunately, this time, Phil has to settle for a meeting with another executive, named Kitami instead. Phil talks up Blue Ribbon's continuing growth and requests that Onitsuka give them exclusive national distribution rights. Kitami explains that Onitsuka wants someone bigger and more established to be its national distributor. Ideally, a company with offices on both coasts, not just the West. Without blinking, Phil responds, "But we do have an office on the East Coast." He was lying through his teeth, assuring Kitami that not only does Blue Ribbon have an office in the East, but will soon have one in the Midwest as well. They can handle national distribution, no problem. Phil is granted his request. He's now the official U.S. distributor of Tiger running shoes. Onitsuka will be sending the next shipment to Blue Ribbon's East Coast office, an office that doesn't even exist. Phil promises to wire them from the address later, once again narrowly escaping Japan with his company still intact. For now. Phil sends Johnson on a mission to find an office somewhere on the East Coast, and he settles in Boston. Back west, Phil makes a new hire, Bob Waddell, a standout runner on Coach Bowerman's track team whose career was tragically cut short in a freak accident. Phil was working full-time as an accountant while spending nights and weekends on the business. He had no social life, but was perfectly content, except for his day job. It was suffocating him. He needed a change. He quits and gets a gig teaching accounting at Portland State instead. There in his classroom, he's captivated by a beautiful student named Penelope Parks. She was so attractive that Phil was finding it hard not to stare at her. One day, she stayed after class and asked if he would consider being her mentor. Phil is taken aback, but keeps his cool long enough to say he'd be honored. He then impulsively asks if she'd like a job, bookkeeping for his shoe company. She's hired, and just a short year later, Miss Parks is promoted to the title of Mrs. Knight. Meanwhile, Coach Bowerman was busy writing a book about running for a nation of sedentary citizens. He was frustrated that the term athlete was regarded by the general public as a title only reserved for the pros. And he wanted to change that perception. When he wasn't at his desk typing, Coach was back at his workbench tinkering. One day, he thought about taking the midsole from one pair and fusing it with the outer sole of another, and sent the specs over to Onitsuka. The result was the perfect long-distance running shoe with a sleek, modern aesthetic. Paying homage to the '68 Summer Olympics that were held in Mexico City, Bowerman wanted to name the new shoe the Aztec. But he was too late, because Adidas had already released a shoe called the Azteca Gold and threatened to sue Blue Ribbon if they didn't change the name of their shoe. Bowerman asked Phil, "Who's that guy who kicked the shit out of the Aztecs?" And Phil replied, "Cortez." To which Bowerman then responded, "Okay. Let's call it the Cortez." Sales exploded, helping Blue Ribbon close the year stronger than ever with $84,000 in revenue. Shortly after the Cortez's release, Bowerman's book was finally published. Jogging would go on to sell 1 million copies and kickstart a movement across America, with Blue Ribbon Sports becoming the trusted source for running shoes. On campus, Phil meets art student Carolyn Davidson and hires her to design print ads. Up to that point, when it came to marketing, they'd just been winging it with crude drawings and made-up words like swoosh fiber. By the end of the 60s, through Blue Ribbon's efforts, 70% of U.S. runners now owned a pair of Tigers. After 5 long years of being in business, Phil is finally able to draw a salary and quit teaching to work on his business full-time. He survived rejection from local shops, clashes with the Marlboro Man, and even quarrels with the bank, all to keep his business afloat while laying the groundwork for Onitsuka to dominate the U.S. market. But rather than thank Phil for his service, Onitsuka decided instead to stab him in the back.